When it comes to the Ace Attorney community, I like to think that the general opinion on how most of the games in the series rank against each other is relatively unanimous. These games are amazing, these games have their issues but are still really great, and these two could use some work. However, I did say most games, because there's one trilogy in particular that has had the community split ever since its inception. You all know it, you all have radically different opinions of it. I am of course talking about the Apollo Justice Trilogy, which is made up of Apollo Justice Ace Attorney, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Dual Destinies, and Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Spirit of Justice. More than any other trilogy, the Ace Attorney community has radically different opinions on all three of these games, with many fans having their favorite and or least favorite games in the series within this trilogy. In my time in this community, I've seen just about every combination of opinions imaginable when it comes to these three games, and lately I've been wondering why that is. I decided to do some digging into what exactly makes the Apollo Justice Trilogy as polarizing as it is. And today I'm going to go through each game within it in order to determine why it is Ace Attorney's most divisive trilogy. Let's begin. After the success of the original Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney trilogy, Capcom was eager to produce yet another sequel for the Nintendo DS. However, there was one major disagreement that would go on to form this new game's greatest overbearing flaw. Series creator Shu Takumi firmly believed that the series had definitively concluded with Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Trials and Tribulations, and that it would be best to let the series end there. When Capcom pushed for him to create a sequel anyways, Takumi did not want Phoenix Wright to appear in the game in any way because he believed that Phoenix's story had been fully explored within the original trilogy already. Unfortunately for him, Capcom insisted that Phoenix Wright appear in this fourth game, and while it was never explicitly stated why, I can only assume that this was done in order to create brand recognition, as starting fresh with an established series can be a risky play sales-wise. So including the protagonist from the previous three games immediately gives fans of the series something that they can easily identify, which in turn gives them more confidence in their purchase of the game. And so, Takumi begrudgingly agreed to help write the game's scenario, and Ace Attorney 4 was born, starring a brand new protagonist by the name of Apollo Justice, and also starring Phoenix Wright, who had been stripped of his attorney's badge, has a daughter by the name of Trucy Wright, and works as a piano player at the Borscht Bowl Club. And the result of this internal conflict between the series creator and Capcom themselves is a game that isn't quite sure what it's trying to be. From the get-go, it is immediately clear that Apollo Justice Ace Attorney is struggling with focusing on its new protagonist Apollo, while also trying to find a way to rope Phoenix Wright into things. On one hand, it's a fresh start complete with new, unique ideas and themes that are tackled throughout the game's 4 cases. Concepts such as having the game's mentor be its main villain, solving multiple smaller crimes in order to solve a bigger one, and using testimony or a jury system in order to indict a criminal as opposed to evidence, are littered throughout the game in order to make it clear to the player that Apollo Justice Ace Attorney is different from what came before it. All of these concepts combine to formulate the game's main theme, that the law is flawed and that big changes need to happen in order to ensure justice for terrible criminals. Which is certainly an interesting angle to take that can definitely lead to some interesting scenarios. Which is also exactly what makes the presence of recurring characters like Phoenix Wright, Emma Skye, and even Dick Gumshoe feel so out of place. The world of Apollo Justice Ace Attorney feels so separated from the original trilogy, as it should really, that these characters feel nothing like who they once were. These versions of Phoenix, Emma, and Gumshoe are snarkier, meaner, and more jaded, which does fit the theme of the game itself, but it also feels disrespectful to fans of the series to show them as shells of their former selves, especially given how satisfying the conclusions to their respective stories were. Combine these character assassinations with how unorthodox the themes and pacing of the game is, and you have a game that newcomers are likely to enjoy and vibe with, but that fans of the original trilogy, myself included, are likely to feel offended and even insulted by. To make matters worse, the inclusion of Phoenix Wright is something that is impossible to ignore because his disbarment is what the entire plot is centered around, making this game that has Apollo Justice in the name more about Phoenix Wright than Apollo Justice. This is most apparent in the game's final case, which Apollo is barely even present in. His backstory is fleshed out ever so slightly when Phoenix is informed that a woman with amnesia from the third case named La Mémoire is both Apollo and Trucy's true mother, but nothing is done to expand upon that revelation as Apollo and Trucy are never even told about this information. This creates a game that, as I said earlier, is stuck in this awkward middle ground that doesn't place enough emphasis on the game's new characters to make them genuinely engaging, and places too much emphasis on trying to continue a story that had already been concluded. And that results in a mess of half-baked ideas that aren't given the space to be fully explored, and multiple spits in the face to fans who played the original trilogy and grown to love its characters. I imagine that these issues were much easier to ignore for players who played Apollo Justice Ace Attorney as their very first game in the series, as they had nothing to compare it to. But for me and many other fans that had seen the peaks that this series could rise to, this game doesn't just feel mediocre, but outright bad. On a personal note, I have not made my disdain for this game a secret in my time creating Ace Attorney content, and that's for all the reasons I listed and more. The game has so many new creative ideas, but I personally feel that it fails to execute any of them effectively, leaving a game that felt more frustrating than anything else to me. And I simply refuse to believe that this is Phoenix Wright and not just some hobo that locked Phoenix into a cellar for 7 years. Regardless, it does have its fans that will defend the game until the bitter end, and fans that will undoubtedly be swarming my comments section as soon as this video goes live. Just promise to be nice, okay? And it's that mixed reception that put Capcom in a sticky situation when developing the next entry in the mainline series for the Nintendo 3DS, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Dual Destinies. Now, before even looking at anything in this game, one thing immediately stands out. The sequel to Apollo Justice Ace Attorney, the second game in the Apollo Justice Trilogy, is titled Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Dual Destinies. Yeah, so from what I can only imagine was the incredibly mixed reception of Apollo Justice Ace Attorney, Capcom decided to have Phoenix Wright return as the series' main protagonist for its next entry. At this point, Shu Takumi had completely stepped away from the main series and had resolved to work on other Ace Attorney titles, leaving the director of the Ace Attorney Investigations duology to take over. It is important to note that Phoenix Wright is not the game's only protagonist, but that key idea of undoing the damage that the previous game created is something that persists throughout the entire game. Dual Destinies doesn't retcon Apollo Justice by any means, as the game still features characters from the game and references events from it, but it does go out of its way to brush those events under the rug in order to start as freshly as possible. It almost feels like an apology of sorts to fans of the original trilogy, as Phoenix is behaving like his usual self again, characters from the original trilogy like Pearl Thay and Miles Edgeworth make their appearance, and the game itself is simply much more traditional in its structure. However, to claim that Dual Destinies makes no effort to spice things up would be a gross understatement, and no better character illustrates my point than the series' third main protagonist, Athena Sykes, who wields the power of the Mood Matrix in order to show the courts the power of analytical psychology, which is a main theme that is carried throughout the game's 5 main cases and DLC case. However, the introduction of Athena accentuates an issue that was already bound to happen between Phoenix and Apollo, and that issue is balancing 3 playable characters at the same time and ensuring that each character gets enough time to develop throughout the story. Dual Destinies presented itself with the near unachievable challenge of tackling Phoenix's return as a defense attorney, continuing Apollo's story in a meaningful way after learning very little about him in his very own game, and leaving a good impression with this new character, Athena Sykes. It was certainly a tricky task to handle, and while I personally believe that the game actually managed to pull it off pretty well, many fans would be quick to disagree with me. Whether or not you like this game likely hinges on 3 major things. Whether or not you like the idea of Phoenix Wright returning as the game's main protagonist, whether or not you like the direction that they take Apollo's character, and whether or not you actually enjoy Athena Sykes as a character. The first 2 factors kind of go hand in hand, as they hinge on how much you enjoyed Apollo Justice Ace Attorney. For those who hated the game, like me, returning Phoenix back to his old self and fleshing out Apollo in a new and interesting way can feel like a nice reset that will help to put things back into order. But for those who enjoyed the game, it can feel awfully disappointing to disregard everything that it had going and essentially rewrite Apollo from scratch. Apollo in particular is taken in a drastically different direction in this game, wearing this admittedly edgy outfit and going on a bit of a rebellious phase as he struggles with deciding who to trust after the murder of his childhood friend. To be fair, there wasn't a lot to draw from Apollo's original game in regards to his character, but this is still a big leap for the guy. And whether or not you enjoy this new characterization of him will determine whether or not you believe he was treated fairly. Regardless of whether you do or not, it is undeniable that Apollo gets the least screen time in this game out of the three by far. Which feels especially disappointing when considering the fact that it's supposed to be his trilogy. It's unclear whether or not the developers knew that Dual Destinies was technically Apollo Justice Ace Attorney 2 when originally developing the game, but it nonetheless feels rather jarring to place so little emphasis on him. The most focus is placed on Athena, as the whole game's main plot hinges on her backstory and connections to the game's main prosecutor, Simon Blackwell. She's clearly the star of the show in Dual Destinies, which is great for players that enjoy her character like myself, but frustrating to players that aren't as interested in her and would rather give the spotlight to Apollo. And this is where the main divide in the Ace Attorney community in regards to this trilogy was originally formed. Dual Destinies made a major effort to undo the bold new steps that Apollo Justice Ace Attorney took and returned to form while also making many new steps of its own. This created two sets of players, those who felt that the game was a breath of fresh air and those that were disappointed with the game's new direction, which is a group of people that typically coincides with fans of Apollo Justice that felt that the game was done dirty. I personally love Dual Destinies, and would consider it to be one of the better games in the Ace Attorney series. But there are a lot of people in the community that consider it to be the worst game in the series, not only for the reasons I listed, but for the game's radical ideas that were unlike anything the series had seen before, whether that was for better or for worse. The final villain in particular is a hotly debated topic, but I'll refrain from getting into that here, not only for spoiler reasons, but because I already discussed that villain in detail. Overall, Dual Destinies was a return to form that unfortunately managed to divide the fanbase in a major way, which once again put the next game, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Spirit of Justice, into a very sticky situation. This brings us to the final game in the Apollo Justice trilogy, which ironically still maintains the Phoenix Wright prefix. Taking feedback received from both Apollo Justice Ace Attorney and Dual Destinies, Spirit of Justice aims to please fans from both games by blending elements from both together in order to create something that everyone can enjoy. While Phoenix Wright may still be present in the title of the game, focus was shifted back towards Apollo for the game's finale in order to properly conclude his story for fans of Apollo Justice Ace Attorney, while simultaneously giving time in the spotlight for Phoenix, Athena, and even Blackwell for Dual Destinies fans. Spirit of Justice even appeals to fans of the original trilogy with the biggest showing of fan service the series has seen yet: the return of Maya Fey. However, in the pursuit of trying to include as many characters as possible within the scope of a single game, Spirit of Justice unfortunately ends up becoming a jack of all trades, a master of none. Don't get me wrong, I do still think it's a good game with some great moments, but I fear that in attempting to please everyone, it ends up pleasing little to no one as much as it could have. The game does still have its fans like the previous two do, but let me properly explain what I mean. Athena and Blackwell are here, but only for a single filler case that has absolutely nothing to do with the game's overarching plot. Maya Fey is back, but she's spending so much time either being accused of murder or getting kidnapped that players are given zero time to even see how she's developed throughout the years. Well, maybe that part is actually accurate to her character, but my point still stands. The game introduces a bunch of new mechanics and concepts through Phoenix Wright's adventures in Khura'in, but it all feels so disconnected from what fans have come to expect that it almost feels like a different series entirely. While these are all great examples, I feel that no character better exemplifies my point than Apollo himself. Big surprise there. Now, to the game's credit, Spirit of Justice does give players the magical turnabout, which feels like a case straight out of Apollo Justice Ace Attorney done right. But Apollo remains MIA from that point onward until the game's final case, when it's revealed that he was born in Khura'in and was raised by the country's most wanted revolutionary, Dirk Sadmahi. And when Dirk gets accused of murdering the country's Minister of Justice, it's up to Apollo to clear his name. The problem with this reveal is how sudden it is. Apollo is a character that was struggling to find his identity in his own game, managed to find an identity as the straight man of the group in Dual Destinies, and is now given a backstory that completely alters the player's perception of him seemingly out of nowhere. This leads to a conclusion where Apollo decides to stay in Khura'in to help rebuild its legal system, leaving Phoenix and Athena to return to Japanifornia without him. It's a relatively satisfying conclusion for the character, but I also can't help but think that it feels unearned, especially when compared to Phoenix's conclusion at the end of his trilogy. This whole finale for Apollo feels even more off when you consider the fact that it's all sprung up onto the player in the final case of the game. Because even though Capcom was willing to close out Apollo's story here, they were too scared to focus the entire game on him and instead opted to rely on Phoenix Wright to sell more copies. I think Spirit of Justice had the right idea and the purest of intentions, to close out Apollo's story in a satisfying way that would leave all types of fans happy. But the game is unfortunately a little too hesitant to commit to its ideas in the same way that Apollo Justice and Dual Destinies were. Those games were controversial, yes, but they weren't afraid to commit to their ideas and flesh them out as much as they could, which is what gives them such passionate fans and such dedicated haters. Spirit of Justice lacks the resolve that its predecessors held, which ends up making it just okay in the eyes of many. This is best exemplified in the post-credits scene of the game, which shows La Mémoire finally telling Phoenix that she plans on telling Apollo and Trucy that she is their mother. This scene is frustrating to me because it shows that the developers were well aware of that lingering plot thread, but once again, they were unwilling to follow through with it all the way and instead opted to acknowledge it at the very end without actually resolving it. This creates a situation where, as I stated earlier, no one is left truly satisfied. Apollo's conclusion felt not only half-baked, but shoehorned into a game that he didn't really belong in to begin with. Fans of Athena felt especially shafted because of the microscopic level of importance that she holds in the game's story. And even fans of Phoenix Wright have to admit that he's taking away the spotlight from characters that need it far more than him at this point. Spirit of Justice goes out of its way to simultaneously incorporate as many characters as it possibly can and as many unique mechanics and themes that it can in order to stand out, yet in the process it ends up becoming what is potentially the least noteworthy game in the series to me. Not the worst, not the best, just the least memorable. Overall, the Apollo Justice Trilogy is a set of games plagued with controversy, which is a fact that can be derived from the very structure of the games themselves. Apollo Justice Ace Attorney attempted to come out the gate swinging with a brand new cast of characters and revolutionary ideas that had not yet been explored. But the inclusion of Phoenix Wright and several other characters from the original trilogy chained it to its past and ruffled the feathers of a lot of fans of that original trilogy. Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Dual Destinies attempted to undo the mess that its predecessor created while simultaneously introducing its own ideas and characters, which divided fans into groups that either liked Apollo Justice Ace Attorney or liked Dual Destinies. Then finally, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Spirit of Justice desperately attempted to salvage things by becoming an experience that fans of both games could enjoy. But in doing so, it ended up leaving both groups relatively unsatisfied. Rather than feel like a complete trilogy, these games feel incredibly disconnected. Each game functions more like a standalone game than a piece of a greater whole, which cannot be said for the original trilogy or either duology in the series. This incredible lack of synergy can best be seen in the way that each game treats Apollo himself. All three games create a rapidly different backstory for Apollo, making it clear as day that Capcom simply wasn't sure what to do with the guy, frequently opting to give Phoenix Wright the spotlight at essentially every opportunity they had. To that end, it almost feels wrong to call this trilogy the Apollo Justice Trilogy, because it's kind of misleading to claim that it's all about Apollo. In reality, it's a set of games that are all trying to achieve something different and set themselves apart from their predecessors, with the levels of success that they reach greatly varying depending on who you ask. The Apollo Justice Trilogy is by no means a bad trilogy. It has some of my favorite moments in the entire franchise, but due to an elaborate web of troubled development, clashing themes, and a struggle to connect everything together cohesively, it is easily Ace Attorney's most divisive trilogy of all time. However, I wouldn't get too worried about it, because Capcom has been doing everything in their power to unite the community once more as of late, and if you ask me, they're doing a fantastic job. The history of the Ace Attorney series may not be perfect, but I think it's safe to say that the future looks bright. Thanks for watching the video, and be sure to let me know what your favorite game from the Apollo Justice Trilogy is down in the comments below. And while you're down there, consider hitting the subscribe button for more deep dives into all things Ace Attorney. For now though, that's all from me. Take care of yourselves.